The first shot did not sound like thunder. It was sharper, tighter, like something ripping through the air itself. For one split second, nobody moved. The hedges of Normandy stood frozen under the gray morning sky, wet with dew, silent except for distant artillery that had already become part of the landscape. Then the Panther burned. You can almost feel the shock of that moment. German infantry froze where they stood. A Panther tank, one of the most feared machines on the battlefield, sat crippled in a narrow lane, its thick armor pierced, flames forcing their way out through the seams of the turret. Just minutes earlier, some of those same soldiers had laughed when they heard what was coming their way. An American tank destroyer, open-topped, thin-skinned, slow to traverse, easy prey, they said. But the joke had just turned into something far darker. To understand how that moment became possible, you have to go back a few months earlier, across the Atlantic, where the M10 tank destroyer was being prepared for a war that had already changed faster than anyone expected. It was early 1944, and American armored doctrine was still shaped by an idea formed years before the war had fully revealed itself. Tanks were meant to support infantry, break through lines, and exploit weakness. Enemy tanks, especially heavy ones, were supposed to be handled by specialized units called tank destroyers. The M10 was one of those tools. It was not designed to brawl, it was built to hunt. At first glance, the M10 did not look impressive. Its armor was thin compared with German heavy tanks. Its turret was open at the top, leaving the crew exposed to shrapnel, small arms fire, and even the weather. The turret itself turned slowly, powered by hand rather than hydraulics. In close combat, that could be fatal. But the real strength of the M10 was never in how it looked. It was in what it carried. The 3-inch M7 gun was the heart of the machine. That gun gave the vehicle its purpose. It had the power to penetrate German armor at ranges where many Allied tanks struggled. It was accurate, dependable, and deadly in the hands of a trained crew. And unlike many tanks, the M10 was designed to move quickly into position, strike, and relocate before the enemy could answer. Even so, on paper it still looked like a compromise. And in the eyes of many German tank crews, it was not something to fear. By the 6th of June 1944, the war had come ashore in Normandy. After the D-Day landings, Allied forces pushed inland slowly, painfully, through a landscape that favored the defender at almost every turn. The Bocage country of northern France was a nightmare for armored warfare. Thick hedgerows, narrow sunken lanes, and broken visibility meant tanks often stumbled into one another at brutally short range. In that kind of country, the advantage usually belonged to whoever saw the other first. And the Germans had something that inspired real fear among Allied crews. The Panther, officially the Panzerkampfwagen V Panther, was one of the most effective tanks of the war. It combined thick-sloped armor with a powerful 75mm high-velocity KWK 42L/70 gun that could destroy most Allied tanks before they ever got close enough to fight back. Its frontal armor was especially formidable, often deflecting incoming rounds that would have torn through other vehicles. German crews trusted it, Allied crews feared it, and when reports spread that American units were fielding open-topped tank destroyers with thin armor, many German soldiers believed they had little to worry about. Some even joked about them. Tin boxes, target practice. In their minds, these vehicles would not last long against a Panther. But war has a brutal way of correcting confidence. On the 18th of July, 1944, during Operation Goodwood, British and Canadian forces launched a massive armored assault east of Caen. Although it was primarily a British-led operation, American units nearby were also drawn into heavy fighting. German defenses were strong, and Panthers played a major role in slowing the Allied advance. In the days that followed, smaller engagements flared across the countryside. One of them would become a quiet but powerful example of how the M10 could change a fight. Near the village of Saint-Aignan-de-Cromsnil, on the 20th of July, 1944, a section of American tank destroyers from the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion moved cautiously through a patchwork of fields and hedges. The air was humid. The ground still bore the scars of recent shelling. Burned-out vehicles lay scattered across the countryside, reminders of how fast things could go wrong and how little time men had to recover once they did. Lieutenant Robert Andrews, commanding one of the M10s, had already been briefed that German armor was active in the area. Panthers had been seen moving between defensive positions, using the terrain to stay hidden until they were ready to strike. Andrews understood the danger. His M10 could not survive a direct hit from a Panther's main gun. Not from the front, often not even from the side. If they were seen first, the fight would probably end before they had any chance to answer. So they moved slowly, carefully. Every hedgerow mattered, every gap mattered, every shadow demanded attention. Then the moment came. Through a break in the hedge ahead, one of the crew spotted movement. A shape. Low, wide, unmistakable. A panther, partially concealed, its long gun barrel aimed toward a road where Allied vehicles had passed earlier that morning. The German crew had not yet seen the M10. Andrews did not hesitate. He ordered his gunner to prepare an armor-piercing M62 round. The distance was roughly 600 yards. Not too far, but not close enough to make the shot easy, especially against the Panther's sloped armor. The gunner adjusted his aim. He knew exactly what mattered. The Panther's side armor, while still dangerous, was not as strong as the front. If they struck it at the right angle, the 3-inch gun had a chance. The seconds stretched. You can almost feel the pressure inside that open turret. The crew exposed. The wind carrying smoke and damp earth. Every second growing longer than it should. Every man knowing that if they failed with the first shot, there might not be time for another. Then Andrews gave the order. Fire. The M10's gun slammed back in recoil, and the sound rolled hard across the fields. The shell crossed the distance in a heartbeat and struck the Panther's side. For one brief instant, nothing happened. Then smoke began to rise. Inside the Panther, the hit had been catastrophic. The round punched through the armor and touched off ammunition and fuel. Flames spread fast, viciously, with no time to contain them. Within moments, the tank was no longer a fighting vehicle. It was a burning wreck. The German crew scrambled to escape, but the damage had already been done. One of the most feared tanks on the battlefield had just been knocked out by a vehicle many had dismissed as fragile and expendable. But the fight was not over. Almost immediately, Andrews ordered his crew to relocate. The M10's real strength was not only in its gun, but in its ability to strike and move before the enemy could answer. To stay in place was to invite return fire, and there were almost certainly more German units somewhere beyond the hedgerows. As the M10 reversed and shifted position, another Panther appeared, this one moving cautiously along a parallel hedge. It had likely heard the shot. Now it was searching. The crew moved fast. Another round was loaded. The gunner tracked the moving target, adjusting for speed, angle, and the broken ground between them. This shot was harder. The Panther was no longer sitting still, and from the front, its armor was far more difficult to penetrate. But once again, the Americans held the one advantage that mattered most. They had seen the enemy first. Andrews directed his driver to edge the vehicle into a slightly better position, using the terrain to improve the angle. The hedge gave them partial cover, enough to mask movement for a few vital seconds. Then the second shot came. This time, the shell struck near the lower side hull, where the armor was weaker. The effect was immediate. The Panther lurched, then stopped cold. Smoke followed, then fire. 2 Panthers destroyed in minutes. In that area, German confidence shifted at once. What should have been a simple engagement had turned into a deadly surprise. The M10s were not the easy targets many had imagined. In the right hands, under the right conditions, they were lethal. And what happened there was not some isolated accident. Across Normandy in late July, similar clashes began to prove the same point again and again. Units such as the 654th Tank Destroyer Battalion and the 773rd Tank Destroyer Battalion reported engagements in which M10 crews used concealment, coordination with infantry scouts, and disciplined positioning to ambush German armor. These were not reckless charges into open ground. They were controlled hunts, measured and deliberate, with every move shaped by terrain, timing, and nerves. In one engagement near Le Désert on the 28th of July, 1944, an M10 platoon waited in concealed positions overlooking a narrow approach road. German armor, including Panthers and Panzer IVs, pushed forward expecting only light resistance. They did not realize they had already been seen. When the first shot was fired, it disabled the lead vehicle and blocked the road. The rest were trapped, forced to maneuver under fire in tight ground with almost no room to recover. Within minutes, multiple German tanks were knocked out or abandoned. The ambush worked not because the M10 was stronger, but because it was used smarter. That was when the doctrine behind the tank destroyer units began to prove itself under real battlefield conditions. These formations were trained to operate independently, often spread out, relying on speed and surprise rather than armor. They depended heavily on reconnaissance, radio communication, and fast decisions made under pressure. Every crew member had a role, and every second mattered. Even the open turret, so often viewed as a fatal weakness, carried unexpected advantages. Commanders could stand and scan the battlefield with a full 360-degree view. Gunners could adjust quickly without the confinement of a closed fighting compartment. In the hedgerow country, where visibility was already broken and narrow, that extra awareness could mean the difference between life and death. But the price of that design was always there. M10 crews remained vulnerable to artillery airbursts, mortar fragments, and sniper fire. A single well-placed grenade could drop directly into the turret. Rain soaked them, cold wore them down. Nothing about these vehicles was comfortable. They were exposed, noisy, and unforgiving machines, and the men inside them knew exactly how little protection stood between them and sudden death. Still, they adapted. Sergeant James Holloway of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion later described how his unit learned to use terrain almost like a weapon. They positioned their M10s behind slight rises, exposing only the gun. They waited for German tanks to appear, often unaware they had entered a kill zone, and then fired into the sides or rear where the armor was weaker. The moment the shot went out, they moved. Sometimes within seconds, it was a constant rhythm of waiting, striking, shifting, surviving. That was how the M10 had to fight. Not by standing toe-to-toe with heavier German armor. Not by pretending to be something it was not. It survived by turning battlefield awareness into violence before the enemy had time to react. And in Normandy, that method was beginning to work with frightening effect. By early August 1944, during Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from Normandy began to take shape. American forces drove hard through German lines west of St. Lo. The battlefield started to change. It became more fluid, less trapped inside the hedgerows, more open to movement and rapid shifts in momentum. In that new phase of the campaign, the M10 revealed another side of its value. Its speed allowed it to keep pace with advancing formations, moving quickly to answer reports of enemy armor. It could be repositioned fast, reinforcing weak points, covering exposed approaches, or exploiting sudden openings before the Germans had time to stabilize. Under those conditions, German units already under pressure found themselves facing danger from directions they had not expected. The Panther was still dangerous. It was still fully capable of destroying Allied vehicles with brutal ease. But it was no longer invincible. American tank destroyer crews had learned important lessons in Normandy, and they had learned them fast. They knew where to aim, they knew when to fire, and they knew when to disappear. German crews, in turn, learned their own lesson. Reports from German officers began to reflect the shift. Engagements that once looked straightforward had become uncertain. Open-topped vehicles that had been dismissed as fragile now had to be treated with caution. Assumptions that had once felt safe no longer held. The battlefield had changed that. Fire had changed that. Experience had changed that. And back in that narrow lane in Normandy, where the first Panther burned under the gray sky, the lesson was simple and unforgiving. War is not only about equipment, it is about how that equipment is used. It is about timing, positioning, nerve, the ability to act in the one moment when hesitation means defeat. The M10 tank destroyer was never a perfect machine. It had flaws, real ones, dangerous ones. Its armor was thin, its turret was open, its traverse was slow. Against a direct hit, it was terribly vulnerable. Nothing about it promised comfort or safety. But in the hands of crews who understood exactly what it could do and exactly what it could not, it became something far more effective than its silhouette suggested. It became a hunter. That was the truth the Germans discovered too late in field after field across Normandy. The men who had mocked it as a tin box, the crews who had imagined it as target practice, found themselves staring at burning Panthers and broken assumptions. They learned that a weapon does not need to look invincible to kill with precision. It only needs the right crew, the right ground, and the right second. That is why the image remained so powerful. A Panther in flames, smoke rising into the damp Norman air, infantry standing frozen, the laughter gone. In that instant, the battlefield delivered its verdict. Confidence without caution is a liability. Underestimating the enemy is an invitation to disaster. And in war, the first mistake can become the last one you ever make. The M10 earned its place not because it was the strongest vehicle in the fight, but because it proved that skill, concealment, coordination, and timing could turn an exposed machine into a deadly answer to one of Germany's most feared tanks. That was its legacy in Normandy. Not perfection, not invulnerability, but effectiveness born from discipline and deadly execution. And that is why the story still matters. Because beneath the steel, beneath the doctrine, beneath the burning wrecks and shattered confidence, it reveals something constant about war itself. Machines matter, firepower matters, armor matters, But the men who understand their weapon better than the enemy understands his own fear, those are often the men who decide what burns and what survives.